So, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I figured by 2025, we would have space. We would have flying cars and von Braun wheels and trips to the moon and Rosie the Robot Maid, if anybody remembers the Jetsons. Rosie, I could use a Rosie the Robot Maid, let me tell you. Yeah, Roomba doesn't do everything. I mean, somebody's got to cook and fold the laundry too, right? But we don't have these things. In many ways, except for twiddling bits, we've been stuck in place for a long time. And I wanted to ask, why is that? Why are we flying into headwinds? I mean, we talk to people, and like our last speaker said, some people say, man doesn't belong in space because God doesn't want us there. Other people go, I don't know, it's too weird, even though Star Trek is cool. And when it comes time to assemble capital, to put together the ventures that we would need to take us there, there's resistance. There aren't many people who will loan or invest. And if they do, they may not loan and invest in the quantities needed in order to get that successful venture to space. So I'm going to ask, how do we intend to pay for getting to space? And what in our history is an analog that will tell us maybe why we face some of the resistance we face? So the big talk for how we're going to pay for space is extraction. If we're not completely Earth-focused, like Starlink and Elon, bless them, then it's extraction. We're going to mine a celestial body. We're going to bring precious metals, especially platinum group metals, which have all kinds of industrial uses, back to Earth. But how much are we bringing back? The estimate out of, I'm going to stick to gold for the purposes of this conversation because, hey, it's a first foray, and gold has use as coinage, as a store of value. The estimate from Cargill's 94 paper, I think it was, on metalliferous asteroids, said that he estimated that we'd get 2,400 metric tons of gold off a 1 kilometer asteroid. Well, in all of human history, the Gold Council estimates that we have mined about 215 metric tons of gold, most all of which is still in existence. Central banks and other financial entities hold about 87,000 metric tons in their reserves in a vault somewhere, or several somewheres. So what would happen to world gold markets if roughly 3%, 2.5% to 3% of all the gold reserves in active financial reserves were suddenly to hit the exchanges? The largest gold exchange in the world, the London Bullion Exchange, can clear a little over 600 metric tons in a day. Its next closest competitor, the Shanghai Gold Exchange, can clear 6. If a market cannot physically clear, we will experience what could gently be called price disruptions until we hit a market clearing price and until they can physically move all the gold out the door. We do that more than once. That isn't just a blip, that becomes a resource shock. So let me tell you a story about the resource shock that defined the modern world. And the story starts in 15th century Spain. At long last, after about 3.5 centuries, the alliance between Aragon and Castile was about to realize its great goal, to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula from the Moor. They just, and to split up all the spoils, of course. They just had one problem. This was the aftermath of the Black Death. Europe lost all its labor. They were in the middle of the Great Bullion famine. So they needed to figure out, how are we going to get enough coin to pay the armies so that we can shove the Moors out of Granada and have the Iberian Peninsula for ourselves? And the answer was they issued debt. They issued euros, which were mortgages essentially on crown debt that could be paid for the lifetime of the euro holder, and asientos, which were short-term contracts, give you the right to perform a particular activity, to sell goods in a particular place, to have the crown buy whatever it is, and so on. That was great. They conquered Granada. Aragon and Castile married. They had trouble servicing their debt. Their Genoese bankers were very, very aware of this, and that gave us Spain's most famous Genoese, Christopher Columbus. He had to go looking for trade routes. He had to go looking for specie, precious metal turned into coin. Why? Because the crowns of Aragon and Castile had enormous debts to pay. And even after they conquered Spain, their work wasn't done. They had wars to fight everywhere. The Habsburg crown convinced the Pope to crown them Holy Roman Emperor. They were the flag bearers of Rome, of the very idea of a state, with the blessing and assent of God and his vicar on earth. Great. That meant they had wars to fight in Italy right away. They had wars to fight in Austria right away. They had wars to fight in the Netherlands right away because the Habsburgs married into the House of Burgundy and ended up inheriting the Netherlands. And they needed taxes to pay their debts. Only the amount of taxes they needed were so great that their holdings were all inspired to revolt. So off they went to the New World. They also abrogated their debts to their existing populations, threw the Jews out, went after the conversos. They needed more. It didn't stop. They thought their prayers were answered, though, when they found a whole mountain of silver at Potosí. They were so intent on capturing all that metal that Manco Capac complained that the snow itself could turn to silver, and still they would not be satisfied. But as fast as that silver came back to Spain, it went right out the door to the crown bankers. They had to fight wars. And on the peninsula, the scarcity of specie was so bad that major regional fairs had to be shut down. Some of them operated years in arrears because they couldn't get their hands on the coin they needed to clear their transactions. The disruption spread, transmitted by the fair routes. You had more silver. A young seminarian at the School of Salamanca, Martín Azpilcueta de Navarro, noted, where there is more coinage, prices appear to be higher. And that continued all the way throughout Europe. It was so bad that it wasn't just the crowns that were in a Red Queen's race. Robert Allen of, I think it was Oxford, found that for the period of the Middle Ages to the 19th century, if you didn't live in the wealthiest cities, your income from the end of the Black Death collapsed in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms. But what happens when you can't afford to buy bread because all of a sudden your coin doesn't purchase as much? There was rebellion. There was rebellion on the Spanish Peninsula. That rebellion spread. The Netherlands split from Spain. It spread into war. In the 17th century, eventually, it gave us the 30 Years' War. My contention is that as the Hansa, the main competitor to Southern power, to Italian power, collapsed, right? Everybody had to create a firewall so they wouldn't have to take in all the silver. But to do that, they had to cut off the Habsburgs. But you couldn't do that. They were the Holy Roman emperors. You had to actually turn your back on Rome in order to build the firewall. And the destabilization continued, and Spain's debts mounted. By the end of the 17th century, the Habsburg crown had declared bankruptcy 4 times. Their debt requirements ate up 96.5% of crown revenues. They had nowhere to go. And the response of the population was, forget this agriculture. I mean, we do our work, we produce our wool. That was the highest value commodity we produced. We get the coin, and what does it buy? They abandoned Spain's most economically productive activities for the hope of quick riches in the New World, and they depopulated the Spanish countryside. A pattern of depopulation that they didn't recover from till the 20th century. And the wars that cascaded across Europe, well, Bavaria didn't recover its population until Bismarck, 2.5 centuries later. So how does that compare to now? Well, the United States government, hold on here, is servicing a debt that takes about 105% of our tax revenues. The story is very similar. So the story that underlies modern finance, that is assumed in the education that bankers get, is that Europe experienced resource shocks in the 17th century. These caused what The Economist magazine termed Dutch disease, actual de-development from the hopes of gaining quick mineral extractive riches. It caused inflation. You know, we tell the inflation story now. Look at the Weimar Republic. And the role of the system is to mitigate risk. And those are the worst systemic risks there are. When you ask people with that kind of frame, what'll happen? When we pay for our activity by dropping 4 days worth of gold clearance on the market periodically, or doing it steadily for over a century, what kind of reaction do you think they'll have? So what do we do now? The petrodollar, the system that's governed the world for a century, is coming to an end, right? We're in a moment of monetary collapse. We're in a moment where the debt of the largest economy in the world is not sustainable. 100% of debt is, or of revenues is really nervous-making. We have to go. Gotta try. Besides, it's the bootstrap to the next step that takes us to the stars. So we're going to need institutions that can clear these transactions. What are we going to use? Banks aren't geared for commodities. They're geared for money. The commodities, or the really big banks, are really geared toward driving people into coal and steel infrastructure, right? The exchanges need new mechanisms. We have to think about what kinds of institutions we're going to develop that will handle the transactions that we're going to impose on the system. There's a legal void. I mean, we have treaties that govern outer space bodies, but we don't really have a system of adjudicating disputes. What happens if we have multiple entities and they try to extract from the same body and there's a dispute? How are we going to adjudicate that without them doing really, really painful things to each other? At the same time, we have to be aware that in this moment, while the monetary system is collapsing, and we can see it, silver markets this week are going through a squeeze. People are demanding physical delivery of silver that is hypothecated, it's financialized, it's fictional. We can see what happens in real time now. As people and as our banks are returning to what we've known for millennia to be money, that's gold and silver. So the idea of flooding markets with large quantities of specie right now is a little bit nervous-making. So financial markets exist to impose order and to address a lot of these concerns. That's good. We have to talk about them. We have to figure out as we go forward, which the Artemis Accords are going to enable us to do, whose law exactly are we going to follow? And we have a conversation that needs to be had, because the institutional resistance we see, it's entirely rational. It's grounded in history. It's not just grounded in history, it's grounded in concern for how the mechanics of the markets are going to work to clear all these transactions. And this is a moment we find ourselves in. So how are we going to begin the conversation? Who are we going to invite in order to tell us how things work now so that we can adjust our activities to be least disruptive? How do we bring more of us into the conversation so that instead of resistance, we can develop cooperation? That's a question I have for you. Thank you. And with that, questions?
Thanks, Connie. Appreciate it. You mentioned the gold markets have a certain capacity for absorbing trades that we could overwhelm with asteroidal resources or wherever. Well, they have a certain capacity because that's all they've needed it to have. Given some teething troubles, why could they not add a couple of zeros to their capacity in the existing exchanges? Why would we need to establish, new institutions or new operations? Couldn't we just expand the ones we've got?
That's a possibility. You'd need to talk to the people who run the exchanges. I have not gone crawling in the vaults. Most of them have a limited physical capacity. But also, it isn't just the exchanges we have to worry about, right? Money, quantized trust, has three functions. It's a unit of exchange, it's a unit of count, it's a store of value. If we start flooding the system with specie, right, what happens to the principal store of value that people have been using for millennia? The people who will suffer most are actually not the ones closest to the financial institutions. That's one. Second, are we going to need to bring all that specie back to Earth? Have you ever heard of rice stones? Yeah, in Micronesia for centuries, they transacted, their money is these giant multi-ton stones on different islands, and everybody just trades title to them, and that's how they know they paid for things. Evidently, that was one of the big inspirations behind the blockchain. But my biggest concern, since money is a bit of a black art, all the shenanigans occur when we talk about the store of value. How do we develop enough economic activity so we can absorb all of that specie in, or some portion of that specie in, without beggaring everybody else? I don't have a good answer to that yet. And I have several historical analogs. But that's going to involve a deep mechanical discussion with people who really are in the bowels of the system. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Hey, Connie, I appreciate the example of the Spanish exploitation in the New World, because that's one that I've used before as an example where we're going in space.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I have a question about is the rate at which the precious metals came back from the New World. Really, they were taken because they'd already been mined, they'd already been extracted and refined by the native population. And so if the Spanish had to depend on mining it themselves, that rate might have been much lower and the impact might have been much lower.
Actually, the first loads certainly were Aztec and Inca gold, right? But they found a whole mountain of silver at Potosí, and they dragooned native populations into mining that. And Spaniards also, from lower classes, also came over, hoping, in a gold rush kind of way, trying to do that. So it couldn't have been just native populations when this activity was sustained for a couple of centuries. We don't have a good estimate of what the original monetary base of metals were in Europe at that time. It would, data quality, right? But we do know that what came back and what kept coming back was enough to overwhelm the system. Does that answer your question? Okay.
You mentioned the petrodollar.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the viability of turning something like gold into a way of storing value for fuel or energy? Because that's basically what, in my mind at least, that's what a petrodollar became. Because if we're talking about barrels of oil versus gold versus dollars versus whatever, we're actually buying energy, stored energy.
Yeah.
So what's the viability of taking those precious metals that we're finding on the asteroids and holding the value of rocket fuel, for example, or semiconductor class metals for energy?
It's a possibility. The Russians are giving it a try right now with the petro ruble, and the Chinese with the petro yuan. All of that is at contest right now, right? The nervous-making thing is we've never had one reserve currency for the entire human race before, and the people who have that control certainly don't want to lose it. So it's a possibility. We get to watch everybody duke it out over the next decade or two to see just how viable it actually is.
Just as a quick follow-up, would that have any correlation with, say, the oil rush when, here in the States, when we started using oil as energy, as, petroleum products, et cetera, we had a bunch of new money.
Yeah.
And the Europeans didn't know what to do with all these crazy Americans with all this money now. Are we looking at something along those lines?
Possibly. I mean, the way British noble houses settled all their debts was they got rich American heiresses to marry in, right? And used their dowries to fix up their falling apart centuries-old castles and so on.
Well, they're still doing it with Harry and Meghan.
Not going to comment on that one. That's a little too much for me.
Sort of makes me wonder if a currency of the future would be some element, some substance that is in itself convertible into fuel, based on what Chris just said. I'm thinking dilithium crystals, of course, or helium-3, or possibly something in the biotech stage where you're trading. Maybe you're trading information. That's a little too close to Bitcoin and blockchain, but the medium of trade is just a solidification of what it is you're actually trading. And I'm not saying I have solutions or even anything. I'm just posing another question that goes along with what you've just said.
Well, energy is the master commodity, right? If you read Chris Martenson at Peak Prosperity and his crash course, it's pretty clear. The global economy is a function currently of extracted hydrocarbon. I contend it's extracted hydrocarbon as processed through Americans, through the United States economy. Sure, we can come up with anything as long as everybody agrees that they will use it as their medium of exchange, or their unit of exchange, their unit of account, and their store of value. And I think that's part of the conversation that has to go forward.
You made some excellent points. I've struggled with this. Economics in space. As soon as you capture an asteroid, let's say it's pure gold or platinum, and once people know about it, you immediately crash that market. Oh no, people know there's like tons of this stuff coming, and all of a sudden, what's the current value? But the other thing is that if you have like unique economic activities, can you more economically do them on Earth? And maybe just put up with lesser quality. And so it leaves fewer and fewer activities. And one of the natures of, it's like with container ships, it initially failed. Obviously a superior way to do it, but these economic adventures don't guarantee success. So then the real question is, what economics are we dealing with? And for me, it all boils down to one thing. It's the economics between people. You put people up into space, they will start naturally wanting to trade and acquire commodities or resources to have value.
Well, yeah, people organize eventually in societies. We say societies organize three ways. We organize as cultures, so we have some set of common values and we can figure out how to talk to each other. We organize politically so that we can, or in governments, so we can perform activities collectively. What kinds of collective activities? Roads, public utilities, national defense, a stable coinage, right? And we organize economically so that we can do what Adam Smith called truck and barter among ourselves, right? So we can specialize in trade and hopefully be able to do more together than we ever could do apart. So yeah, eventually the hope is people outside the gravity well, self-sustaining populations outside the gravity well, we don't even know what it takes to do that. Microgravity appears to be a very hostile place to humans or to life reproducing so far. So is it a possibility? Yes. There are other examples. After World War II, Europe was so awash in dollars, many of them counterfeit. They said, if any of these dollars come home, we're going to just destroy the American economy through inflation. So we created the euro dollar, and we said those dollars have to stay overseas to settle requirements, on dollar-denominated accounts elsewhere, and those dollars will never come home. There's no saying we couldn't do something like that with some portion of the precious metals. We could collateralize them. So, maybe we don't flood the market with all these metals at once, but we collateralize them and use the liquidity we get for other productive activities. That's another possibility. And there's nothing saying we can't create new orbital rhinestones and swap title to these hunks of refined metal floating or orbiting in this orbit or that orbit or the other orbit. The point is that these are things that we are going to develop in a conversation. We have to start the conversation, not just with us. We have to expand out and talk to the people who have to actually make this stuff work. Did that answer your question? Yes. Okay.